You're listening to Data Science Leaders, the premier podcast for executives tackling the world's most important challenges using the power of machine learning. Let's dive in. How do you deliver value with ethical AI? Who is responsible for responsible AI? How do you put it into practice? And can we make our organizations more ethical with the help of AI? This episode is coming to you from the RevX conference in London, where I got to ask these questions of Chris Wiggins, Chief Data Scientist at the New York Times, Professor of Applied Math at Columbia University, and author of the recent books How Data Happened and Data Science in Context. Here's our discussion. I'm hearing folks talk less about ethical AI and much more frequently talking about responsible AI, trustworthy AI, accountability, and so on and so forth. I guess I'm curious your thoughts on whether or not there has been an evolution there, or whether or not in the way that people are thinking about it and going about it.
Yeah, I think all of these words get pushed. So they're drifting targets, but they're drifting targets because people are pushing them different ways. So ethics, I think, as a word, had a lot more valence, I think 5 or 6 years ago, as people were starting to come to grapple with the power of data-empowered algorithms in shaping our personal, political, and professional realities. I think for many people, two things happened around the word ethics. One is that it's very fuzzy. So you started to see pushback because people could define ethics to be anything. So that was sad. And the other thing about ethics is that I think for many people, it struck them as a very high bar. And so for many companies, they sort of retreated towards safety, which I think is sort of in some ways a lower bar than ethics. So there's been a narrative in which safety has come to the fore. Responsibility is another one that sort of aligns with design principles. And then all of this coincided with the development in the computer science, the technical computer science community, around what was originally called FAT. Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency. Eventually, they changed that name to Fairness, Accountability, FACT, Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency. So that created an interesting technical environment, adding on to a long-standing tradition of applied ethics for the last 75 years and sort of high philosophy of ethics for the last 2,000 years.
Not to mention the fact that we don't seem to do ourselves any favors in this industry when it comes to being precise about our terminology. Like data science, okay, what are we referring to? Artificial intelligence, okay, what element of artificial intelligence are we referring to? And when it comes to responsible AI and ethical AI, again, there's this vagueness in terms of our terminology and language and what we're looking at and what we're going after.
Yes, which I think is good when you're making up new fields and bad when you're trying to prevent great harms, right? Or you're trying to align an organization. So one of the things you should, I think about when you're trying to align an organization around responsibility or ethics is first align on why you're doing it. If you have just one person who's saying we should do something ethical, or worse, some person who says that we should do something ethical, but they don't really care, that's not really useful. So I think the first part is to align everybody on what problem you're solving. I mean, I think that's true with any strategic initiative, right? You have strategy in your name. So with any strategic initiative, first you need to figure out what problem do we think we're solving. And I think that's true for responsibility and ethics within the enterprise as well.
Well, I was wondering whether or not some of the transition from ethics to responsible AI was a quest for value. How do we drive value in the organization with this concept? And with ethics, it can be very defensive. It's we don't want to get in trouble. We don't want to get to be on the front page of the New York Times or something along those lines. But when we're starting to talk about responsible AI, now there's an element of business performance here. The model should perform reliably. The model in a way that is expected, that it should be continuously improved, that it should be sufficiently validated, that it comply on the legal side of things, as well as on an ethical and moral point of view as well. So I guess I'm wondering whether or not there's this movement towards trying to find an alignment with how do we ensure that our models are fair and ethical, but also can we at the same time ensure that they perform better, that they are more trusted by the organization, that they are more safe for everyone to use.
I do think trust is intimately associated. And I noticed that it came up quite a bit with Raj. So trust, of course, has internal and external aspects. So external trust or responsibility is, do your customers, external stakeholders, potential regulators trust that you're doing something you should be doing? So I do think that there's some amount of trust insurance when you think about responsibility as the organizing principle. That said, I think often with actual practicing data scientists, they're looking for something that's slightly different than responsibility. In my experience, students, young data scientists, senior data scientists actually, often have this sense of fear of moral injury. They want to know that in 3 years, they will look back on their project. And even if they did a project that got them promoted, they won't feel like that was a bad thing. I did something that was hurtful or
didn't train the Google model that identified minorities as gorillas.
Many, in order to be fair to all of our other companies, I won't start enumerating potential examples, but yes. So, and you see this all the time. People leave a company and then they publish multiple hundreds of pages of memos or, go on speaking tours about things that they did at their prior companies. I think in general, young technologists want to know that they have some sort of intellectual framework for knowing that they're not going to do something that later they'll look back and think as bad. That's very difficult because, as I often say, as an engineering faculty member, we don't train young engineers with any sort of intellectual framework or even vocabulary for thinking through those trade-offs. How will we know that we're not going to do something that later commits moral injury to ourselves?
Well, it's definitely the case that we want our data scientists to be equipped to go in and leverage the tools and build models that are ethical and responsible. But I often wonder whether or not we put too much responsibility on them.
Yes.
In the sense of that they are not in positions where they can, for example, ensure that a model that they created isn't going and used in another context and for a purpose that it wasn't designed for.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So one of the things that some tech ethicists in large companies have said is that natural design patterns in engineering, like modularity or separation of concerns, come with the fact that you're building an API to spec and you have no idea what product is going to be calling that API. So yeah, that is a limit to which the engineers themselves have agency over the capability as it eventually is deployed as product. That's true.
Well, I remember a couple of years ago, it was popular when it came to tackling ethical AI to go in and first set up an ethical AI board, and then secondly, do an audit of the organization for ethical AI risks, and then potentially somewhere along the lines have a big discussion around what those ethical AI principles are. And then, a year later, after you're completed with this process and nothing really necessarily has gotten done, people put that to the side and no longer want to participate, and it gets shelved. I guess we don't do that anymore for the most part, as far as I can tell. But I'm curious how that has changed and whether or not there is now a different owner for this. So rather than be looking to an ethical AI board to be an owner of the ethical and fair use of AI in the organization, now, for better or for worse, congratulations, the room of AI leaders, they're looking to the AI leader to be that single throat to choke, or the person who is at the end of the day going to be responsible for the ethical use of it. We can go and we can punt that up and say, oh, no, well, the CEO is ultimately responsible, but how could they be? They're not going to be directly involved in this on a day-to-day basis. So whether you like it or not, you as either chief data scientist, head of AI, some chief data analytics officer, you are likely going to be taking on that mantle, whether you like it or not. Or is there a different route?
There's a lot to unpack in what you just said. First of all, that's a series of extremely astute observations. You're absolutely right. So maybe I'll just start with one, which is ownership. You're absolutely right that one of the problems of responsibility or ethics is who owns ethics. And in fact, there's a great paper about this called Who Owns Ethics by Dana Boyd and Jake Metcalf and Manny Moss, who are workers at Data and Society. Dana herself is longtime Microsoft research. And they did a lot of work embedding in tech companies, trying to figure out how does that tech company actually think about ethics. And it's unclear who owns ethics. So yes, in some ways, the CEO bears ultimate responsibility, but at some point, somebody is going to get thrown under the bus, and it's not always the CEO. Some more, if I can be a little more analytic about some of the pieces in what you just said. One thing is, I do think it's somewhat different for smaller and larger enterprises. So the thing we were saying about modularity and separation of concerns is true at the scale of a massive tech company, like $1 trillion tech company, where you really can have compartmentalization and a platform team that by design has no idea what sort of product area is going to eventually deploy that platform. However, many of us work in companies that are smaller than that, where you have a pretty good sense for how that line of code that you're writing is eventually going to be experienced by an end user or a customer. The other thing that you said that I think is really good is, what does it mean to do ethics? So I think you're right that just defining ethics is not the whole battle. So part of responsible or ethical AI, whatever you want to call it, includes people. Who's going to own ethics? Is it going to be you're going to hire somebody who's going to be the VP of ethics and everybody else is going to go about their job knowing that, okay, we hired somebody to be in charge of that so we can keep doing whatever? Is it going to be the CEO? Is it going to say ethics is owned by everybody? Or is it going to be a board, and that board needs to be broad enough that it touches the whole org, but it needs to be, a set of people for whom they can afford somewhere between 10 and 90% of their time to be thinking about ethical aspects. The second thing, so that you need to find a set of people who own ethics. You also need to define ethics. So one of the things that I think pushed people away from ethics was that ethics got defined by different things in different companies, or not at all. So for me, coming from academia, that's sad, because human subjects research, which is a field within academia, has worked really hard to define ethics. And this is an American bias for a few minutes, if you'll indulge me. But in the States, there actually is on the books of federal law since the 70s what it means for something to be ethical human subjects research. And it matters because of U.S. taxpayer dollars funding research that was considered unethical.
The Bellman Principles.
Correct. Okay, so basically there was a series of acts in human subject research in the 60s and 70s that were so bad that the U.S. government was forced to define a government specification for ethics, which sounds pretty paradoxical. So what they did is they got together a diverse set of people who originally first met in a place called the Belmont Conference. So the eventual report 4 years later was called Belmont Report. And that included researchers, lawyers, philosophers, a priest, like a wide diversity of people thinking about what it actually means to be ethical. And what they hit on was something that was about principles, multiple principles that are designed to be in tension. So the approach here is principlism. And a key point here is having principles does not mean this is my principle and, I organize everything around one principle. The whole point is that principles are designed to be in tension. And you should think about principles in such a way that they are meant to be comprehensive. They should cover future use cases, but they are not meant to be entirely compatible. So, for example, the principles that they hit on in Belmont were, I'll call them rights, harms, and justice, but a fancier version is respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So respect for persons includes our ideas around informed consent and making sure that we're not tricking our users and things like that. But if somebody's going to enter into a research experiment, which was the context of human subject research, or a product experience, they should know what they're getting themselves into. There's a limit to that because I'm not going to show them the source code. And even if I would show them the source code, we don't necessarily understand our own AI models. So that's not necessarily informed. Harms. We should make a balance between the harms and benefits that we inflict on people. That's immediately in tension because you can say, well, look, I'm going to benefit this person so much. Why would I bother asking them if they wanted the thing? Moreover, there's an arrogance or a hubris associated with consequentialism, which is predicting harms. Because we don't exactly know what's going to happen. We deploy these algorithms. We have to monitor people and then mitigate the harms. Justice is another one that's got some trickiness to it. By justice, do you mean restorative justice, or do you mean fairness, or do you mean equality? And even if you define it as fairness, there's multiple technical definitions of fairness, each of which famously has their politics. In any event, defining a set of principles at least provides a common vocabulary for people in an org so they can make difficult trade-offs, or they can have hard questions. And the same way that a KPI aligns an organization, right? A KPI, if we all align carefully on what KPI we're trying to optimize, everybody's got a common vocabulary. They can solve hard problems by saying this algo or that algo makes that KPI go up. Similarly, a clear definition of ethics is really useful to have everybody in the org align on a few principles. And a few principles is key, actually. You may know Bridgewater, for example, the hedge fund that has 99 principles, right? And that's enough principles that you can pretty much pick out a principle to justify whatever, right? So having a few set of principles.
It's the Groucho Marx line. It's like, those are my principles. If you don't like them, I've got more.
Yes, that is one of many good Groucho Marx lines. Okay, then finally there's process. So you pointed out that there needs to be some process, like an audit, right? So you've got who does it, how do you define it, and then what is the actual process to implement it? That's the part where I think the human subject research framework from academia has had the hardest time being ingested into tech companies, because the definition of ethics from research institutions has a design for manifesting it, which is around the flow of money from outside funders, like the government, into research universities. And that's a mechanism that's completely absent from the company. So one of the reasons that I think that the applied ethical tradition from the 70s hasn't been more easily ingested into company is like, what is the review board that gets to say no? Because there's no board that goes through product launches or promotions or hirings or other sort of power moments like decision points in a company at which you can easily inject ethics.
Well, that's an area where I could imagine folks say, well, at the end of the day, what I'm doing in my organization isn't a research project. At least
Exactly.
I don't think of it as a research project. I'm looking to go in and apply a model that has been developed elsewhere. I'm going to go in and fine-tune it maybe. I'm going to put guardrails around it. I'm going to apply it in this particular setting. Why do I need to think of, why are those the relevant principles for what I'm trying to do here? I guess I'm thinking about, I often use the analogy of flight. And when I'm willing to go on EasyJet or Ryanair and trust that I'm going to get there safely, it's not because of the principles that they put on their website. It's because all of the processes and the people who are involved and the technology solutions that are implemented there. But versus if I was investigating new ways to fly on with human subjects, I would all of a sudden be very, very concerned about those principles, because you're guiding a wide range of different nebulous activities that have yet to be defined. And so hence the principles are the guiding point that helps me design that research on new and better ways of flight. But do I need those principles? Are the principles as important when I'm ensuring something like the safety of flying and treating the customers appropriately?
Yes. So that's a very good point. So if you think about flight, it's a great analogy. It shows up a lot in discussions of AI. So Jan LeCun, for example, likes to rely on flight all the time.
He's stolen that one too.
Yeah, that guy. So flight is an example of engineering. Like we've been flying for a while, or let's say bridge building, right? We've been building bridges for, many years. So when somebody builds a bridge, there is a checklist. So I don't think you said the word checklist, but that's part of the process for something where you've done it 1,000 times and you know exactly how it's supposed to work, is make sure that you do that thing. Checklists, of course, show up in surgery as well, right? However, in research, you're doing a thing you've never done before. As the mathematician Hamming famously said, in engineering, if you don't know what you're doing, you should not be doing it. In science, if you know what you're doing, you should not be doing it. Meaning, there's a field of human endeavor in which you're doing something and you don't exactly know what you're doing yet. There's another field of human endeavor in which you should not be doing it if you don't exactly know what you're doing, right? Like building bridges. Building bridges is an arena in which it's natural to have a checklist, because we're pretty real sure we know what we should do and what could go wrong if we don't do it. Research is, on the other hand, a time of very difficult decisions. And when you have difficult decisions, it's useful to have principles which are very high level, not so high level that they're not actionable, but high level enough that you can align on them and you can use them in future situations. However, from principles, you need to distill standards, rules, lines of code, product decisions. Adjudicating all of that is a human decision and involves, somebody that has the trust of the org or the trust of the community. And I'm directly ripping that off from constitutional law in the United States. So constitutional law in the United States, a lot of the principles in the Constitution are stated at a high level. And the whole idea in constitutional law is then you have judges and a hierarchically organized set of judges who distill from principles down to standards, rules, laws. Some of the aspects of the Constitution are pretty real clear. You got to be 35 years old. Some of the constitutions are a little, vague, like naturally born citizen. Is that okay if you're born in Panama? Unclear. Some of them are like right out confusing, like a well-regulated militia being necessary to defend the government, right to bear arms, et cetera, et cetera. In any event, let me not debate con law. Instead, principles, like aligning on principles, it's useful if they're high level enough that they're going to be useful for whatever new tech you're inventing in 6 months, but low level enough that they actually can be actionable for some org.
Well, so it sounds like potentially the takeaway from this would be, yes, have your principles, establish your principles, but very, very quickly get to the standards, the processes, and the equivalent, the policies in your organization that you're going to be driving, because it's in getting through all 4 of those stages that you actually get to the applied and get to the value off of this.
Yeah, I would scratch the word quickly. I would say very carefully. And that work is the actual hard work. Like you need to have people who are bought in, who have aligned on what the principles actually mean, and then do the hard work to figure out how am I going to apply these principles to an individual case. But I think the other sort of strategy point, getting back to your job title, is, you can't just put up the principles and then everything's going to go. You can't just name somebody to be in charge of it and then everything's going to go. You really need to think about all of those things in concert. What problem are we solving by establishing responsible practice? How are we going to define responsible practice? Who's going to own it? And what is the process going to be for ensuring that this definition of ethics or responsibility somehow constrains and guides our difficult decisions? I really think all of those things are necessary. And I think many of the failures of companies is that just do one of those things. They'll just hire a VP of ethics and then it doesn't work out.
A very unfair question. Are there any organizations out there right now that you would see we should be emulating that do this well, or at least are taking the right steps?
That is very difficult. No, I would rely on books rather than companies. I can recommend a book or two. for people to...
No worries. No worries. I'm in the same position. So I wouldn't be able to do something similar, not because they don't exist, but because I don't know enough about what they're doing there. But ask me again in about 6 months and I'll be able to point to a couple of them. I have high hopes for Scotiabank. But speaking about laws, very curious about your thoughts on regulation. Where is this going? Is there anything that we could see based off of the history of data regulation and privacy regulation that we think could translate over when it comes to AI regulation?
Yeah. Well, regulation is interesting. I guess a couple of things that are interesting around AI regulation is to look back on the fights around privacy regulation from the 1970s in the US. So in the US, there was a lot of concern about power and data, but it was state control of data. So there was a series of basically consumer-oriented concerns, which led to a bunch of regulations that limited the ability of the state to possess and use data in a way that was unchecked. And in fact, modern ideas like right to be forgotten or right to edit your data are right there in some of the laws from the 1970s in the United States. So for example, as an educator in the States, I'm bound by a law called FERPA, which is originally called the Buckley Amendment, which limits my ability to release information about my students. But that law was originally because parents didn't trust the schools and they wanted to be able to see their own kids' records and correct it if there was an error in those records. So there are ways in which we are living a digital equivalent now. Only the locus of power is no longer the state having too much data, it's private companies have too much data. That's one interesting aspect of regulation, is that historical example. A second interesting aspect of regulation is the sectoral nature of regulation in the United States as opposed to in other jurisdictions. So the sectoral nature means that laws in the United States are around particular verticals. There's a set of financial laws. There's a set of laws around alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Let's not talk about how it ended up linked together, but you've got different bureaus for these different bunches of human activity. And so you don't see a lot of laws on the books like we're just going to regulate AI as a tech, right? There are some exceptions, right? Federal Trade Commission and antitrust, Department of Justice in general, but a lot of the laws are organized around economic verticals rather than a technology. That said, a bunch of U.S. companies are active in the EU. A bunch of U.S. companies are interested in doing business outside the United States borders, which means either they write an entirely separate BI system for inside the States and inside some other country, or they just upskill all of their BI to be compliant with new regs in EU as they may be interpreted. As you know, these regs are stated at a high level, and then they get adjudicated as to what that means in terms of actual business intelligence decisions. So those are some aspects of regulation. I hang on with lawyers too much.
Well, I'm struck in your books. You had some wonderful recommendations about what good regulation would look like. And I think you have one in there about where you should regulate use cases and not the technology. And I think there was another one in there about regulating clear problems versus potential problems. My apologies for paraphrasing those somewhat. I guess I'm curious. I mean, those sound like they absolutely make sense. But to what degree do you think they're actually being adopted in the regulations that are being promulgated, either on the EU AI Act side of things or whatever we're getting on the US side?
I don't know that I've seen any evidence that they're being adopted. I would say like the American cartoon of GDPR EU regulation is that it's too early, that the failures haven't happened yet and we should wait for a failure before we create regulation. This is typical of US law over the last 125 years. We have to wait for a financial crash before we create, a branch of the government that regulates Securities and Exchange Commission, for example.
But that would be consistent with your principle too, though. That until we know what the clear problem is, we shouldn't be regulating it.
Yes, but all of these damages, I would argue, are scale-free. Like the financial crash of 1929 was qualitatively visible to people. Wow, that's a crash. That's why we called it a crash. Harms from algorithms are not necessarily going to be societal-wide front-page news in big font, right? A lot of the harms from automated decision systems are small and they are heterogeneously distributed. That is, those harms are often inflicted on people who are not in positions of great power, and they're not inflicted on the entirety of a country.
So it'd be like thinking about redlining in the United States in terms of it. Yes, we found out about it, but long after the harm had already been done.
Some people found out about it long after. So there's a book by Virginia Eubanks called Automated Inequality, where she takes an ethnographic approach here, and she looks at different case studies of people whose lives have been impacted by automating decision systems. And there's a great line in the book where she says, the famous line, "The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet," can be interpreted in its opposite way, right? Usually that line is used by technologists to mean the few of us have access to the coolest tools, and later everyone uses tools. But it also can be interpreted as new algorithmically inflicted harms are first deployed on people who are not in positions of power. And then later, as it's stress tested on those people from that particular group, sometimes it's inflicted on people from other countries, then it becomes more generally inflicted on a wider set of people. So you can enjoy the book, Automated Inequality, if you'd like to know more about that.
Well, speaking about your book, you had a wonderful line in there. I think it was a quote from Mosteller, which was, "It's easy to lie with statistics. It's harder to lie without them."
Yeah.
And it's often struck me in the AI space that, if you think that AI models are unfair or unethical, have you tried people? And it seems like there's this great opportunity to make our organizations more fair, more ethical using models, because with models, unlike people, you can test them, you can monitor them, you can go in and mitigate them in a way that, yes, in a test setting, you can go in and ask a person what it is that they're going to do and how they're going to make a decision. But when they're actually out in the real world, they don't behave that way, versus a model that does. Are there opportunities for us to create more ethical organizations, teams, societies using these technologies?
So you're making a great point. So Mosteller's line, it's easy to lie with statistics, but it's a lot easier to lie without them, is in part a statement about fields of human endeavor in which we are interested in knowing what is true. Right. And in engineering or building products, it's not necessarily the case that what's true is our central goal. Maybe there's a particular key performance indicator we want to go up, or we just have a vision of some new product that's going to surprise and delight, and we want to build it. And if people are surprised and delighted, then that was a win. But your flip side of it about how this relates to AI, I think is really important, because one of the things that happens in the dialogue around AI is people will look at an algorithm and say, well, that algorithm is unfair. They very rarely quantify how unfair is the actual I of which that AI is A, meaning there are many fields where there's an artificial intelligence and there's some natural intelligence that they're trying to emulate away, and possibly they've even trained on it. But very rarely when people critique a new AI, do they go and then benchmark it against what happens when human beings do that equivalent task. So I do think that's true in the whole field of ethics, responsibility, and fairness. It's important to go look at what is the valence or the ethical audit of the humans who are doing the equivalent task. If nothing else, because often those humans are the humans on whom the training data are based, right? And in fact, that's one of the ways that machine learners often say, well, look, machine learning is unbiased. It's just that the people were biased, right? Is they say, look, my math was fine. It's just that the training data was reflective of the lack of fairness in the people on whom I was trained. So long and short of it, yes, Mosteller, this sort of updated Mosteller star that you're proposing is a good thing to remember, that we need to be critical of algorithms. And by critical, I don't mean say they're bad, but critical, like inquire and audit them. But we also, particularly when it comes to AI, when there's a clear human function that we're trying to emulate, we should also apply the same ruler to what's being done by the people that we're trying to model, or whose function we might be augmenting or even replacing with some automated decision system.
Chris, thank you very, very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your great questions.
That was Chris Wiggins and I speaking at RevX London. For more of Chris, please check out his 2 recent books, How Data Happened, A History from the Age of Reason to the Age of Algorithms, and his other book, Data Science in Context. To see all of the sessions from the RevX conferences in New York, Philadelphia, and London, please go to domino.ai/RevX. You've been listening to Data Science Leaders from Domino Data Lab. If you found our discussion insightful, be sure to subscribe to never miss an episode. Your support helps us deliver cutting-edge content and keep the data science community informed and inspired. We appreciate every review. Until next time.